You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on in to Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, writer for Sports Illustrated for various SEC-related things, but on this podcast specifically, we take a dive into all things Kentucky athletics. On today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be recapping the Wildcats' close win over the LSU Tigers. We are also going to be speaking with Isaac Shade of the Locked On College Basketball Podcast to talk about some of the frustrations you guys have with the program. We're also going to talk about John Calipari, and we're going to ask a question that I'm sure all of you are going to be perfectly fine with, and none of you will get upset with in the comments below. Thank you so much for making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. I want to remind everybody out there that we are free and available on all platforms, and if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean a ton as we march closer and closer to 3,000 subs. I would stay tuned, by the way, for that question. We talk about John Calipari. We are not taking anything seriously. Let's be very clear, but we do have an interesting conversation about him that coming up later on in the show. But for now, 74-71, Wildcats get a victory over the LSU Tigers. Kentucky now 10-4 on the year, 1-1 in the SEC. Plain and simple. Wildcats needed this one. Wildcats needed some momentum to build on as they move into the massive contest with the Alabama Crimson Tide on Saturday. Not a lot of chance for Kentucky to win that one, according to analytics websites out there. Excuse me, sorry. I have a little bit of a cough going on. I'm trying to prevent it, but this was a closer than anticipated game. There was a lot of hot scoring in the first half. Things slowed down in the second. Things kind of adjusted, I think, defensively for both teams. But the one thing I want to take away from this game before we dive into the numbers, what have we been talking about on this show for the past, I would say, week and a half? Coach Calipari has made a huge emphasis about toughness. And not just physical toughness, but also mental toughness, about getting into a place where you can have confidence in what you're doing and you can be effective instead of falling apart on the offensive end. We saw Kentucky in this game show some mental toughness. Now, let's also go ahead and get this out of the way so that we're not walking through this entire game from beginning to end. This Kentucky team, late in this game, once again, completely fell apart on the offensive end of the floor. Now, I will say, the bucket that Cason Wallace got late was a really nice play because clearly I started to, I'm starting to give Kentucky a little bit of the benefit of benefit of the doubt, right? So Kentucky needed a basket badly. First possession, if I'm not mistaken, they sat around, literally nobody moved. The crowd started to get upset about it, and then if I'm not mistaken, they turned the ball over. The next possession, they needed a bucket still. Exact same thing happened. Kentucky did absolutely nothing on offense. There was literally no movement. Everybody was very upset about it. They kicked it to the corner at the last minute. Toppin pump faked, and then he decided to pull up for a three, and he hit it. So it was a huge shot for Kentucky in a possession where there wasn't really a whole lot going on. It was, in my opinion, a shot that would not have been made typically, especially given the type of possession it was. And then Cason Wallace on his layup at the basket, I'd have to go back and actually watch it a third time because I've already watched it, obviously, live, watched the highlights, but it was some type of like screen set to clear, like an empty play on the left side where they ran the action late because it was the exact same thing. They came down the floor. They didn't do anything. They were kind of passing the ball back and forth. Everybody was getting upset, like, what is Kentucky doing? No, they were just, in my opinion, setting things up for that play to see if they could get a look for Cason Wallace at the rim, and it was a really, really nice, well-designed thing there. So all of this to say, sure, there were still some issues late, right? But hey, Kentucky looked like they were starting to at least make an attempt to answer some of their problems. And I'm not just sitting here focusing on the entire end of the game, by the way. I'm talking about the entire thing. They were incredibly efficient at different points in this game. They shot very well. The free throw line didn't come back to bite them for the first time in a while. They only had 6 turnovers. I think a lot of this had to do with the fact that Cal, whenever he's needed to kind of be clutch, whenever he's needed to like focus in and get things done, you notice how Kentucky has consistently gone to a tighter rotation. This game, because C.J. Frederick was out, because Lance Ware was out, they only played 7 players. And the bench players, Damian Collins and Antonio Reeves, only played 9 and 14 minutes respectively. It was purely the starting lineup for the most part, and Kentucky's players executed. Jacob Toppin, I know that there are several players that stood out in this game in this starting rotation, but Jacob Toppin I want to get to here first. So we talked about on yesterday's episode about how Jacob Toppin could be the piece that turns this season around. Well, obviously, he hit the biggest shot of the game there at the end. 9 of 13 from the floor, though. He had 3 rebounds, 3 assists, a steal, and a block, only 1 foul, and 21 points in 31 minutes. That is not to be expected every single night, but that is what we need. That is what I was talking about. Jacob Toppin, after showing what he could do against Louisville, I said, guys, it was against a horrible team, but he has shown the potential in the past, and he is showing again, hey, I have the ability to be a consistent scorer in the paint, night in and night out. I'm an athletic, bouncy forward. I can do a lot of different things if I just have the confidence. And I think you saw in this game, especially considering he hit that three-pointer late, which he has not been. I believe he was shooting like 15% from the three on the year. That is big for him. I could not be more happy with the way that he's played 2 games in a row now. Very excited for Jacob Toppin. Really hope that he's able to continue things moving forward into this Alabama game. The other thing I want to get to here is Sahvir Wheeler. Wheeler did not have a turnover, I think, until the last 3 or 4 minutes of this contest. He finished with 9 assists compared to 2 turnovers. And this is something that Jimmy Dykes, the color analyst on ESPN, continued to point out. And this is something that I had written down in my notes. Like, even early on, you notice what Sahvir Wheeler looked like. Despite shooting 4 of 10 from the floor, he did shoot 3 of 5 from 3, knocked down a couple of huge buckets for the Wildcats. He looked controlled. Kentucky didn't look out of sorts, even whenever they were doing things late incorrectly, in my opinion. They didn't look panicked. They didn't look like they were freaking out. And that's something that we have not seen from the Wildcats so far this year, is even when things are going good, they look rushed, they look hasty, they look like they are panicking. And we saw that against LSU in that contest in Baton Rouge last year. That was one of my most frustrated episodes I think I've ever put out, was that game. And just the disbelief that Kentucky couldn't handle things, and also the officiating. We'll get to the officiating in just a second, but this was the turnaround game Kentucky needed. Now, was it the final score that the Wildcats wanted? No, they were up by 10 at one point. But I am very pleased with the way that this one ended, with all of the starting rotation playing pretty solid, outside of maybe Chris Livingston, who shot 1 of 5 from the floor. I think collectively as a whole, this unit did a lot of good things. Oscar Tshiebwe did what he did. He only took 9 shots, but he made 7 of them. At one point, he was 7 of 7 in this game at 16 points, 19 points, 16 rebounds. Just again, it was one of the more complete showings I've seen from Kentucky in quite some time. And look, the defense, I'll say, last thing here before we get to the officiating, the defense was a problem. But there were so many different shots that LSU hit, particularly KJ Williams, where it was the epitome of just good defense, great offense. There were just some really tough shots the Tigers hit that I just did not expect them to. And look, Ken Palm said that LSU was going to score 63 in this game. I thought it would be a little bit higher. They ended up shooting almost 50% from the floor, 44% from 3. Adam Miller had 5 threes in this game, transfer from Illinois. And then they were 8 of 10 from the foul line. Both these teams shot much better than anticipated. Kentucky dominated the rebounding totals, 31-22. A lot of that had to do with what Oscar Tshiebwe was doing, obviously. Sahvir Wheeler was actually second with 6 rebounds in total. So this was a solid win, and we've talked about it, guys. The SEC is going to be rough this year. I'm very happy with the way that this one turned out. I would have liked to have seen this kind of been an 8 or 9 point win. Again, the Wildcats just kind of doing some weird, questionable things there at the very end of the game. But you've got to be pleased with, even when things were falling apart, they still managed to show up and they still managed to finish the job. Build upon that, because you've got a really tough opponent coming in, or you're going to Tuscaloosa rather this Saturday. And that is going to be, as we've said for weeks now, every SEC game is going to be a dogfight. This 4-game stretch for the Wildcats, we said that if they could get to 3-1, it would be big. They are 1-0 so far. Let's see if we can make it 2-0 Saturday in Tuscaloosa. Before we get to our conversation with Isaac Shade, officiating, Doug Shows, I've saw a lot of things on Twitter that I'm not just going to sit here and reiterate, oh, he's an egotistical official that just wants to control the game and get all the attention. I'm just going to say that he's not good. He's not good at his job. There were a couple different fouls in this game where I think at one point he literally cost Kentucky. It was like a 6 or an 8 point swing. And it was like back to back to back. Like, oh my goodness, those are like awful. And it led to buckets, therefore. Like, Cason Wallace was going to clean up a rebound. And if anything, it should have been a foul on the LSU player for reaching in and being aggressive while Wallace was grabbing a rebound that was about to go out of bounds. It was a ridiculous call. So Doug Shows, shout out to him in midseason form. He is undefeated and not too good at his job. All right, hey, before we get to our conversation with Isaac Shade, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at betonline.net. BetOnline is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to college basketball. The World Cup just ended. They've got every single sport you can think of over at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They are always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info, and you can head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. That is BetOnline, where the game starts.
Joining me off the top here is the host of Locked On Kentucky, Mr. Lance Dawe. We want to thank you for making this your first listen or watch every single day. Don't forget, we're free and available anywhere you get podcasts. Coming up later on today's show, North Carolina has received 2 top 30 commits in the class of 24 in the past week, vaulting them to the number 1 class currently. We will unpack both of those guys with Jason Jordan, our director of college basketball recruiting. But before we get to that, Lance, Kentucky survives on Tuesday night. They shouldn't have had to survive, but they did. 74-71 over LSU in Rupp, a place that I've been just once, but it was to see Taylor Swift.
Oh,
It's not wrong. I'm actually being very serious.
Oh, I respect it.
It was a gift for my wife's birthday one year. Despite the win, there's been more talk from Big Blue Nation than I ever remember about Coach Cal's place in Lexington. Bigger than the start to this year, it's been building. Let me just run through a couple quick numbers, and then I just want to see where you're at with it, what you're hearing, and where we go from here. 2021, the year after COVID canceled everything. Obviously, kind of a miserable year for the Wildcats. 9-16, 8-9 in the SEC. Last season, 26-7, 14-4, a very solid year, if unspectacular by Kentucky standards. But obviously, the loss to St. Peter's taints things, and they didn't win the SEC regular season or conference title. This year, off to a 10-4 start, 1-1 in the SEC. Remains to be seen what will happen in terms of conference championships and things like that. The last Final Four was 2015. The last and only national championship under John Calipari is 2012. Notably, haven't won an NCAA tournament game since the quote-unquote lifetime 10-year contract was announced. And it certainly doesn't help that used the UCLA job to get that leverage. And now UCLA has done really well under Mick Cronin with, yikes, Johnny Juzang leading the way. All that to say, the fan base, Lance, is understandably frustrated. The question becomes, do the decision makers feel the same way as the fan base?
I think it's an interesting time to be a Kentucky fan right now because, Isaac, I started doing this show a little bit over a year ago, and I thought in March, whenever the loss to St. Peter's came, that this would kind of be water under the bridge, right? Eventually, things would start to kind of shape up. Things would return to form. I was very excited about this upcoming season, and I did not expect the collapse I think we've seen in this early season in big games to actually happen. We heard a lot of talk this offseason about change, about adjustments, about modernizing certain things on the floor, and we just haven't seen that. And so it's quickly started to shift from the tone in the fan base, from my perspective, from, oh, maybe it's a small minority, to, okay, now almost everyone is pointing out the flaws that are happening right now, both on and off the court for Kentucky. A big point of contention earlier this offseason was recruiting, and I was like, I think that's going to eventually come around. Kentucky has proven that they can do that. Coach Cal obviously went out and signed one of the best classes, if not the best class in next year's upcoming recruiting cycle. I think right now, based on what we've heard from the fan base, there are legitimate frustrations and there are legitimate concern. Now, does that mean that there is legitimate frustration and concern from the people in power? I think that's another question with a different answer. Right now, Kentucky is locked in seemingly to a lifetime contract, so to speak, with John Calipari. And you and I were talking just a little bit before we went on air. It feels like if Kentucky were to go that route, it would not necessarily be the wisest thing considering how much money they would have to pay to get rid of a national title winning coach. Now, something I will say here quickly, Isaac, it has been a decade since he has won that national title. And on top of that, what is Kentucky if not a team that consistently competes for national titles? They haven't won an NCAA tournament game, like you mentioned, in quite some time. I mean, at some point, you have to start asking the question, when do things change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're right. Like, I did the math a little bit ago, and if my number crunching is correct, if Kentucky was to buy out John Calipari after this season, they would owe him $39.75 million still. I mean, it's just dumb. And as you said, this recruiting class coming in is ballers. They are ballers. Not to mention, who knows what Kentucky will do in the transfer portal as they've continued to do. And so it just seems like it doesn't make any sense to really begin to have that conversation. But man, I don't think we're at a tipping point. As you said, I think the answer is different from the decision makers than it is the fan base. But the fan base is a lot of those people with a lot of those dollars that you would need if you were going to make any changes. So you don't want to head in a different direction than you're heading right now. That is certainly for sure.
And something I'll say right now, as far as the short term goes, I mean, I think it's very valid, the frustrations that we're seeing. I mean, obviously, with the issues with the offense in the half court, we've seen a lot of struggles so far this year with Kentucky in crunch time, just not really knowing what to do. I mean, you talked about that close win over LSU last night. I mean, just a brutal game there at the very end where you saw several possessions where Kentucky just literally did not have any movement. Had Jacob Toppin not made that corner three, we could be talking about a loss, and we could be continuing to talk about a directionless Kentucky that doesn't really seem to have a lot of confidence in itself. So the short term, I absolutely understand the frustration, and I'm right there with the front fan base. If you've been listening to my podcast for any sort of amount of time over the past couple of months, I've been right there. Now, again, I want to reiterate, it does not mean a coaching change has to happen at this moment, right? Things can be adjusted. And I honestly do think when you go back and watch that LSU game, you did see maybe Kentucky starting to maybe change some things and head in the right direction.
I agree. Up to the point of, when things kind of fell apart in the last couple minutes, I think they had built a 10-point lead. And I believe the commentators even said, I can't even remember who it was now, but even said, to me, this is the best I've seen Kentucky other than non-conference bye games and other than Louisville. And if that's so, like, you're moving in the right direction. And I would tend to agree with that. Like, there was cohesion. Things looked good. Maybe we're getting, Oscar Tshiebwe back to full form now, all of these kind of things. It was a good night for Sahvir Wheeler, shooting wise and things like that. If he can do that, watch out, folks. Here we go. Now, Lance, just so that we've done it, if and when we get to the point of saying it's time, John Calipari is deciding to walk away, or they've come up with and backed up a truck with the world's stupidest amount of money, who would be some of those people we would begin to look at?
Now, again, we're just we're just putting out a hypothetical here. This could be either 2 years from now, or it could be whenever Cal finally decides to hang it up a decade from now. We don't know how much longer John Calipari is going to be here, but Isaac, to kind of humor the conversation, I think there are two names that you have heard more than any others out there, and that would be Nate Oates and that would be Jay Wright. Now, whether or not Jay Wright is interested in coming out of retirement to coach it for the Wildcats, I don't think that's reality there. But Nate Oates is somebody that I personally would be very excited about as Kentucky's new head coach, because he hits the two things you want. He's a good recruiter, and he's an X's and O's guy. You look at Alabama and the way they play the 5 out. I mean, that's the direction the game is headed over the past half decade. Right. And it's what thrives. And right now, Alabama's the cream of the crop in the SEC. They've got some really talented 5-star freshmen that are producing. Guys like Brandon Miller. I mean, I think that he would be, as far as finding somebody to maybe replace and sustain the success that Cal had, I think he would definitely be a solid potential option. Outside of that, Isaac, I mean, this was a conversation that I had quite a bit on my show earlier this summer, is that with some of the fans that were really upset, I'm like, guys, who is going to replace John Calipari? I mean, is there a coach out there right now that fans and boosters and the athletic department collectively would be comfortable with? Yeah. Everybody's got to be okay with this next decision. It's got to be somebody that is worth their salt. And so I just don't know if there are a whole lot of names out there in college basketball right now that would leave their current job to go to Kentucky. But I will say this, I have no idea if he's interested in the job or not, but Nate Oates, I think, just looking at his resume and looking at what he's doing with the Crimson Tide right now, he would be a really, really good hire. I think a lot of people would be happy with him.
You know, it's funny. I hadn't even heard you have those conversations. He's literally the name on my notes at the top of my list. Okay. I love Nate Oates, and I think he would be massive. I think it would make sense to at least think about Mark Pope, bringing somebody back home.
Sure.
And then you can't not make a call to guys like Scott Drew and Mark Few, because it's the same thing that the North Carolina went through after Roy Williams retired. You got to make those dudes tell you no. Who are at the highest level of the sport. And so a really interesting conversation, one that, as you've kind of alluded to, not outright said, but I'll say it, is premature, I think, in both of our estimations. I think for me that John Calipari, even though we're not at the top or the height of Kentucky success right now that the Wildcats and Big Blue Nation are used to seeing, but I believe that he has earned the right to walk away on his own terms, and his contract says as much, quite frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And premature, I definitely think, is a good word for it. But again, just want to reiterate, look, there are several guys right now that I don't think would walk away from their job. But I think, to your point, Isaac, you can't just leave them alone. You definitely have to go and reach out to them. So if Kentucky does choose to move on, I would hope that the fan base would understand, regardless of who the hire is, that it would be made in the best interest of the program's future specifically, and the goal would be to get back to winning national titles. And so I certainly hope that they make that decision if they do choose to walk away from Calipari, or they force Calipari to resign, essentially. I hope that they're not making that decision lightly. I think it's very important that Kentucky times this right if they ever do it in the future. And I hope that the whole process is made very carefully.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we got this year and then 6 more years left on this lifetime contract. So we will continue to monitor it. But folks, I don't think we're anywhere near anything drastic happening in Lexington.
All right, that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. Thank you so much to Isaac Shade for sitting down and having that conversation with us. Look, I know some of you may be upset with the way that we talked about Cal and talked about a potential replacement for him, who that could be. I would just like to go out there and say I don't think it's going to happen. I'm going to reiterate it. Don't think it's going to happen. But it's always fun to just have different conversations, just in theory, because, it's always cool to see what could be potentially coming. I've definitely had a change of perspective since the summer about Coach Cal and about whether or not Kentucky it could potentially find a coach that would be capable enough of kind of carrying things over. That one guy in particular being Nate Oates. But again, very happy with what Cal's doing right now, at least showing signs of progress, and I hope that he's going to continue to do it. And look, I'll say this right here. If things don't work out this year, that does not mean we fire him next season. That does not make sense for him to either resign or get fired. Again, like Isaac said, we're looking at $30 million plus to dole out to him. That's ridiculous. You don't fire a national championship winning coach and give him $30 million plus to walk away. It was like 39. You just don't do that. Next year, with all of this talent coming in, if he does not produce results, then we start to have some concerns. And that doesn't mean you fire him. So I don't know. That's my take on it. What do you think? You can leave it in the YouTube comments below, or you can hit me on the socials. And that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hey, again, you can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On UK. You can follow me on Twitter at @LanceDawe_. Follow the show on Instagram at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the YouTube comments. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and God bless.